Hello, good people. I'm sorry I'm kind of late. I decided to do this on my iPad. Let's see how many people are in. I wonder if I'm hard to find. I see one. Good job. You found me. I see two. I'm going to put in remind that I am broadcasting. I see 4. 7! There must be a little lag. I remember this from class. 9, 13. Oh my gosh, this is like positive reinforcement, like crazy. You can tell I'm not a famous YouTuber. Oh, I lost one. Only down to 12, 11. 11. Try and get that light out of here. Oh, here, I look like I have a halo. I don't want it to be, I don't want you to think about leaving out of shot. Can't really figure out how to get this. Maybe if my head is in the, maybe I'm overthinking this. I've had too many days to myself to overthink everything. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started because those of you who are here, I don't want to waste your time. And we know that people later can opt in and watch this later. I do hope that is my hope. I haven't used YouTube. I usually use Periscope, as you know. But this is hopefully better. Time will tell. Okay, so we have a test tomorrow. I'm sorry that we have to do that, but we just can't lose too many days and still get through the curriculum and make sure that you're prepared for the test so that you can do well and earn some college credit. So that is the goal. What I want to do today, at this point in the day, is go over this graphing federal powers activity. So we've been, and so let me just kind of lay this out. We're going to go over this handout and make sure that you understand kind of the ebb and flow of federal power from the time period of 1819 to 2010. And you know what the takeaways are and which cases you actually need to know. Then I'm going to show you a sample free response question and help you see what the free response questions are going to be like and talk a little bit about the multiple choice. Then I want to get you to, in the comments, look at the review sheet online and tell me things you want me to talk more about. What I'm going to do at 2 o'clock is just kind of breeze through the review sheet and talk a little bit about each thing. But I'm curious to know what you really want me to emphasize because you're really lost about it, okay? This review sheet is less detailed than the ones later. So I probably will spend a little time talking about each thing just to make sure I hit all the high points, okay? So that's the plan for right now. And then at 2 o'clock, instead of 7 o'clock tonight, at 2 o'clock today, I will lead the review for the actual test. Okay, so this is just finishing up the content, getting you ready for the review session, and then at 2, I'll lead the review session. Okay? All right. So you did homework like this, and hopefully your takeaway, hopefully your line looks something like this, okay? Kind of a 2-hump camel. Remember, you might have had different magnitude or whatever to your line, but hopefully it has this kind of appearance. And so your takeaway from looking at these court cases should be that federal power has grown and ebbed and grown and ebbed and grown, okay, over this time period, okay? So let's just explain why and how we know this based on what the court cases were about. So we started with McCulloch versus Maryland, and we've already talked about how it grew federal power. I think that you guys actually started at 5 and we went from here. So you're probably starting up here somewhere. We know that McCulloch versus Maryland justified the national bank under the necessary and proper clause. It said the bank was necessary and proper, so federal power went up. And then we know that Gibbons versus Ogden made federal power go up again because it said it reinforced the Commerce Clause and said that only the federal government can control trade between states. So those are two uses of the kind of implied powers of the Constitution to further grow the power of the federal branch. Okay? Now, next thing we have is Schechter versus U.S. This was a court case. Oh, is it backwards for you guys? I think I can flip it. Let me see. I usually know on Facebook Live I know how to flip this, but I don't know how to flip it here. So sorry, but this is Schechter versus U.S. This was when during the Great Depression, and the federal government was trying to control trade within states, and try and force these small businesses to meet federal kind of regulation codes. And the problem was that the federal government can only regulate trade between states. They're not supposed to regulate trade that only takes place within a state. So these farmers who were coming under this regulation sued and basically said the federal government is out of bounds, and the federal courts agreed. So federal power shrank because now the federal government was kind of reprimanded for doing things they weren't supposed to do. The same thing happened in U.S. v. Butler. In the case of U.S. v. Butler, the federal government was destroying food during the Great Depression. I know this sounds weird, but there was actually too much food, overproduction of food, which was a major cause of the Great Depression, which is weird because you think of people going hungry. So that's part of the irony of the Great Depression. So the federal government created this huge program that actually paid farmers not to plant and also paid farmers to slaughter pigs, pour milk down drains, and destroy food. And this just went against the sensibilities of Americans during a time when people were hungry. And so this went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically said that there was no constitutional basis for this kind of involvement of the federal government into the fundamental running of the economy. So the federal government had to figure out some other ways to try and bring up farm prices without destroying food. So that happened here in Wickard versus Filburn. And it basically, they said, they started price supports, which meant that farmers would not destroy their crops, but put them in storage. And then when prices went up, reached something called parity, they would sell them. And the government would loan them money in the meantime. That was a Band-Aid to replace destroying the food, this price supports idea. And it was found to be constitutional. So the federal government kind of created a workaround by which they did fundamentally involve themselves in the free market in a way that affected prices, but without destroying food. So federal power grew as the federal government now figured out a way to be involved in basic market forces, including prices. Okay. Typically in a free market, the government has no ability to set prices or affect prices directly. Okay? All right. Then, so federal power started to grow back after that. So then we have South Dakota versus Dole. And this was about in the 1980s when, as part of the war on drugs, the Reagan administration wanted to force all the states to raise their drinking ages to 21. And he did this by manipulating highway money. He basically said, it's up to the states to set their drinking ages, but if they don't set them to 21 by this date, I'm going to cut off their highway money. Well, the states sued and said this was an illegal involvement of the federal government in state law matters, and the Supreme Court said it was totally fine. So fiscal federalism, the growth of the power of the federal government just simply through the power of the purse, was reinforced, and that led to a high point in federal power. Okay, then we had the U.S. v. Lopez case, and this was where the federal government tried to get involved in gun-free zones in schools. And the federal government ruled that, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had just totally overstepped its bounds. That it's up to the states to make gun laws and gun rules, and it's up to the states if they want to define areas where guns are or are not allowed, that is within their jurisdiction, and that the federal government really has no say in that because it doesn't cross state lines. So remember that there's 3 cases that are circled here because they're ones you might need to know cold, on a test, and that's McCullough versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, and US v. Lopez. Those are the only ones on here that I've seen that you actually needed to know by case name, okay, in the multiple choice or those things, okay? But the other ones do contribute to this kind of narrative about the limits to federal power and the ways in which federal power have expanded. Okay, then we had the 2000 US v. Morrison case. And this was another case where the federal government was trying to get involved into state crimes. Remember that the states make almost all the laws about crimes that happen within a single state. This happened to be about domestic violence, and the federal government was trying to get involved in influencing the definition and punishment of domestic violence. And the Supreme Court ruled that they had simply overstepped their bounds again. So one limit to the federal government is anything having to do with the definition or punishment of state crimes within state boundaries. Okay? Then here we have kind of a pushback against even that. It's called Gonzalez versus Reich. And in 2005, there were some states that had legalized marijuana, recreational and or medicinal. And the federal government continued to rule that that substance was illegal and that they would continue to criminally prosecute people. And in this court case, the Supreme Court ruled that that was within their right to do that, the states could not basically undermine federal law, which had made those substances illegal, without federal approval, which they did not get. So this right here is like still the big debate about, lately the federal government has just been selectively enforcing the law. And that's why the Trump administration and Attorney General Jeff Sessions are thinking about cracking down on the states. And this case tells us that it's within their right to do so, and that the states can't basically ignore federal law through their legalization of recreational medical marijuana. Okay? And then finally, there's this case, Comstock versus U.S. And that was also where the federal government, the Adam Walsh Act had been passed, and it basically tried to continue punishing or affecting sex offenders after they had finished their punishment at the state level. It was trying to impose civil penalties on sex offenders. And in this case, they pushed back and said the federal government didn't have any right to get involved in that above and beyond what the state was doing. And through the necessary and proper clause, the federal Supreme Court ruled that since sex offenders are specifically hard to rehabilitate, that they continued to be a threat to society, and therefore it was necessary and proper for the federal government to get involved when the states were unwilling to. Okay? So your takeaway here is that federal power ebbs and flows and is very much dependent upon the rulings of the Supreme Court in their interpretation of the law, and that court precedent therefore informs in different areas what the government can and cannot do. So these cases are all about economic powers. These cases are trying to help define boundaries related to crime and punishment. And so there are different policy areas where these court rulings are constantly kind of helping establish boundaries, very specific, more clear boundaries about how federal power does or does not work. Okay? So, can y'all comment? Are there any ways for y'all to ask me any questions? Is there something you want to know about this graphic? All 14 of yous? Oh, this is really not good if y'all can't comment. Let me see if chat viewing options. Oh. So I want a live chat. All messages are visible. Oh, there. I just found it. Hello, Matthew. I saw your comment. It was at 10:19. So what time is it? Oh, yes. So that was like kind of real time. Yes. Thank you. So there's a delay. So now you're all going to tell me that you can comment, which is nice. So thank you for that. And I'm going to pause for just a second for any questions. All right, your test review sheet is at angelascioli.com under Unit 1. Okay, so let's look at the bell still ring, even though you're not here. Isn't that cute? And it's funny, when it rings, I still kind of like jump like, oh, gotta do something. Like a well-trained lab rat. Okay, so your test has 33 multiple choice questions on it. Okay, you need to get ready, because these multiple choice questions, especially if you're a sophomore and haven't taken an AP class before, they're going to kind of ruffle your feathers a little bit, because there's always two answers that seem perfectly acceptable, and then you have to figure out which one of those is actually the best answer. And it makes you kind of like question everything you know. For me, psychologically, it just kind of makes me think, well, do I know anything? Like, if I don't know this? So don't let them break you down like that. Okay, eliminate the answer choices you're sure are not right, and then when you get down to those two, think it through as quickly as you can, and then just commit. Okay, because on the AP exam you have less than a minute per question, so speed actually is kind of the essence, and so you don't want to overthink it, overguess it. Okay, just gotta keep going and do your best. Okay, but get ready, because you might be used to taking tests where if you've studied and you know everything, then the multiple choice is easy, right? That's kind of how the way I build tests in my other classes is that if you've studied and you know the material, I want you to get 100, okay? It's not really how these tests are built, and they're scored on kind of like a sliding scale. And so they're really just trying to figure out, who is truly mastered a subject. And then they let all the scores sift out and accordingly. So just be prepared for that. And if there has to be a curve, there has to be a curve, right? But if there are people who understand this subject at a really great level, then and they can get these questions right, then that's great, and we should know that. Okay? So just be prepared. The multiple choice can just be a little destabilizing, I would say. And if you know that, hopefully then it doesn't really make you feel like you don't know your subject matter when you do. Okay? All right, so let's just look at a typical FRQ question. Okay? Let's look at this one right here. Port a Hemplo. All right, it's called Democracy and Republic. I'm going to read it to you because I'm afraid it's actually backwards on... I wonder if I do this. No, I'm just kidding. I'm afraid it's actually backwards on the screen. So let me read it to you, and we can think through it a little bit. It says, in the Federalist Paper number 10, James Madison expressed concern over the possibility that both majority and minority factions would have too much power over the government. And he presented ways of minimizing that danger. The United States Constitution established a democratic government, but also contained several provisions that limited majority rule. Throughout the next 2 centuries, the role of majority rule in the United States government and politics continued to change. Okay, so that's just a happy little backstory to kind of set the scene. FRQ questions don't always have that. If they do, attend to them, but it's really when you get down to this business that you really have to pay attention to every single word, okay? Because every single word is important, even though the question looks deceivingly short. Okay, so it says, identify the part of the national government that was originally most closely tied to citizens. Identify the part of the national government that was originally most closely tied to citizens. Okay. So identify means you just have to name it. You just have to name it. Okay, so let's think about what is the answer they're looking for. Are they looking for the president? Is the president most closely tied to the citizens of the United States? Somebody chime in and tell me if the president is the answer. I mean, we elect the president, right? So, is that the answer? That is the answer? Well, how closely tied are we to the president if there's an electoral college? There you go. Okay, so they're actually not that closely tied. Remember that the whole idea behind the electoral college was to put a barrier between mob rule and the president so that the elite of society could intervene if the people picked someone inappropriate. Okay, so it's not the presidency. Is it the Supreme Court? Is it the courts? No, because the courts are appointed. They're not even elected, for heaven's sakes. So is it the Senate? The Senate's elected, right? Good. Why is it not the Senate? All right, we're moving towards consensus that it's not the Senate. The question is, don't worry, you're not late. That's right. They were elected by the state legislatures back then, not directly by the people. It's not until the 17th Amendment. Remember, the Senate was originally built to be like the upper chamber of elites. Okay, so what's the obvious answer? Exactly. Good job. Good job, Justin Hickland. Is Drew home? Tell him to get in on this hot review session. Yes, very good. It is the House of Representatives because they were the only body directly elected by the people. And that's where explain comes in. Do you notice what word my answer had in it? Because. So identify House of Representatives because they were the only chamber directly elected by the people. Okay? Let's look at the next one. Identify 2 ways the United States Constitution limited majority rule. And explain how those measures limited majority rule. So another identify and explain. So identify 2 ways the United States Constitution limited majority rule. So there you could talk about all the things we just talked about. You could talk about the Electoral College and how it made sure that the people did not directly elect the president. You can talk about how the Senate was appointed by the state legislatures. You can talk about how we were a republic, that we do not vote on laws. We vote on elected officials who will make laws. Okay? You could talk about how judges are appointed, not elected, in the federal government. Okay? So you'd have to identify the thing you're going to talk about and then explain how it actually limits majority rule. Okay? So that's just an example of what the FRQs are like. Okay? They're very much like our learning statements in class. Okay? Where they use one of the task words that I've trained you on. So identify just means list. Let's look at those task words together, which are always in your folders. Okay, so these words. Identify means you just list or enumerate. Define, you give a meaning for a word or concept, and examples may help to demonstrate your understanding. Okay, then there's describe. And describe as providing a depiction or portrayal of something in its most significant characteristics. Okay? And then there's explain, which always has the word because in it. And then there's compare. Remember with compare that you have to give similarities and differences. You should say a similarity is blank. And for example, in this institution, it's like this, and it's similar to this one because it's also like this, and the thing they share in common is this. Okay? So for compare, you almost need to insult the intelligence of the reader and make it very clear which ones are similarities, which ones are differences, and prove that, okay? So it's almost the opposite of what your English teacher taught you about a comparison where you don't have to like be so forthright in that process. You actually do for this test. Okay? So, that will hopefully get you ready for our 2 o'clock test review. What I would like you to do is chime in on the comments here and look over your review sheet and tell me things that you really want me to talk more about. Now, does that mean I have to like sit here and play elevator music while you type in your comments? Maybe you should message me on Remind. What would be the best way for you to send me information about what you want me to review? Oh, good. Pretty good. Oh, that's a very good one. Yeah, we haven't talked about that at all. Thanks. Okay. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is have you comment if you can on this video, even after it ends, and I'll check here for comments. And then before 2 o'clock, I'll also check my Remind feed for messages. So in case you can't figure out how to comment here, that you can comment on Remind. Okay? So there's 2 ways for you to give me feedback for that review session. Okay? So 2 o'clock, I will see you here. If you aren't able to attend, I will make sure that the video is posted. So what I'll do is I'll check this one to make sure this all worked out, and then it's available for a while. And once I know that that's all good and kosher, then I'll know about the review too, and to make sure that this platform is going to work. Okay? Alrighty, well, I hope you're enjoying what seems to be a pretty rainy day. I don't know if y'all noticed that they had school all around us, and it went really badly, and now they've canceled it. So despite the fact Wake County might have looked a little ridiculous last night when they called off school, I think they might have made the right call. So we might have differing opinions about that. All right, I will see you at 2. Adios. Let's see if I can figure out how to actually stop this. Yes.